Okay, good morning, everybody. Today I will be talking about the notes on tragedy and comedy. So let's begin. So these masks are obviously very familiar, or at least they are to me. This is the comedy mask, or comic mask, that is also known as that, and the tragedy mask. So these masks originally originate from ancient Greece, and they are the masks worn by the actors in this era. And if you look at the comic mask, that's a recognition of foolishness or absurdity. And the tragedy mask is just a symbol of unhappy endings and just works that bring out sad feelings or any negative emotions, such as that one. Now, all drama falls under either a tragedy classification or a comedy. Now, this drama has led to the production of several plays, but classifying all these plays is nearly impossible because each play is just deviates so profusely from each one. So that's why the principal ones that are used are tragedy and comedy. So if we begin with tragedy, a tragedy is just described as, we'll get more into it, but Aristotle's his view on tragedy really shaped how we think of tragedy and how we define it. So his definition was that a tragedy is a replica of actions that evoke strong emotions such as pity or fear. And a typical tragedy is a sad, unhappy ending, i.e., like a death of the protagonist or our main character. Now, his insights, again, created the foundation to the basic ideas about comedy and tragedy. And there are 6 key points to his view, which is, we're going to go more in detail in the next coming slides. So it's usually that the protagonist is noble and he is a character that is very admirable. Now, this character also has a tragic flaw that later is connected to, fate and other elements of the plot. And then he goes on to the hero's misfortune and then the ultimate takeaway of, the plot and the story. So in the end, the audience feels a lot of different emotions, and a tragedy again invokes these kind of emotions. So the hero and his tragic flaw. So usually in a tragic literary work piece, the protagonist is outstanding, he is admirable, and typically, specifically in Shakespeare and like ancient Greece, it is a king or a prince. And typically, that in itself is a symbol of good fortune. It shows that the character is held in a really high standard, and his fall is what enables the audience to pity him because he is regarded so highly compared to other people in the story. Now, the hero is good, but he is not perfect. So he typically has a hamartia, and now this is responsible for his own downfall. So it is usually either, ignorance, or he has a fault of pride, which is also called hubris. He is jealous or has a bad temper, and ultimately it's just, his own fault. So, but it is also argued that the character is not aware of his fault, but it is argued that maybe he is. Now, this is also very alarming, and which is why it is an argument, is because it would mean that if the character was aware, then that would mean that just the person's flaws would be very destructive and catastrophic. So, a protagonist's fate and misfortune. So, although the hero's downfall is entirely his fault, there are other elements that do add on to his misfortune, such as an accident, fate itself in the story, or another kind of villainy or any outside force that add on to his undoing. And this combination is precisely what makes it a tragedy. It's the hero's greatness, his hamartia that makes him fall, and just the added fate. Now, it is also then, seen that although his downfall was partially his fault, his misfortune is not deserved. Again, to quote more specifically what the book said, was that the punishment exceeds the crime. So yes, it was his fault that his downfall was his fault. The audience then just thinks that it was a waste of human potential. Again, coming back to the character's greatness, and this reminds me a lot of Medea in last semester's reading. Yes, although Jason was partly his fault for his own undoing after cheating on Medea, yet losing his sons, and again even Medea's own faults too. She ended up losing her sons as well too. So that really fits in, and that's again a Greek tragedy. So even though there is a lot of loss, in the end, as Aristotle believed, the character the hero goes through a self-awareness, a certain wisdom. He goes from his fault that could be ignorance, and he moves on to knowledge, and he ends up accepting his fate versus cursing it, and is what also causes the audience to feel different feelings, such as compassion and awe. Because typically, although it was a sad ending, the reader is moved at the idea that the protagonist was still able to grow, and they are not left, again, very, very sad, beaten down, and it just evokes a strong emotion in them. Now, moving on to comedy. So there are two types of comedy. It's scornful comedy versus romantic comedy. Now, scornful comedy is usually the older one and the more dominant one. So this type of comedy portrays human weakness. It shows flaws and ridicules them. It makes fun. An example of this would be William Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream. And versus, romantic comedy is just an emphasis on empathic characters. These characters are usually likable. Their journey ends usually in a happy way, and it's not challenging at all, which is the opposite of what you find in a tragedy, was that the characters are a bit more complex. They have their faults. So to wrap up a little bit on comedy versus tragedy. So a comedy usually puts a protagonist in groups to emphasize their commonness. The plot does not show logical cause and effect, which is again something that is seen in tragedy. Everything happens because of something. It's all a chain, and that is not the case in comedy. And this often leads to a deus ex machina, which is a typical kind of divine intervention where just something unlikely just comes and sweeps in and saves the day. And it's usually meant for laughter and again to illuminate human nature. Now, a part of comedy is farce. So a farce is just an improbable situation, and again, it then leads to stuff like practical jokes and physical things such as tripping on a bench or knocking to each other. Just actions that are gonna make the audience laugh. Versus in a tragedy, where typically the protagonist is left alone, it's isolated, and it's just focused on them to again highlight that they're unique. And again, that again comes back to how the protagonist is greater and he is better than not in the sense that he's better than everybody else, but yes, he is held in a much higher standard, and again is why his fall brings a tragedy. So under this branch, there's also a melodrama, and these are usually moral issues that are oversimplified. So it can be like a mom and a baby are evicted, a girl tied to tracks, and a hero saves her. So this is not complex at all. It's more commercial, and a lot of this is shown in various films, and that is just your typical melodrama. I think of like many shows that I watch. It's just that's where it comes from. But yeah, thank you for listening. Thank you for watching, and I hope this brief summary on tragedy and comedy worked for you.